Historical timeline of ELL cases and laws. Brown v. Board of Education, 1954. Brown v. Board of Education was a U.S. Supreme Court case ruled in 1954. The court case ruled that states must give equal educational opportunities to all students. This in turn created the path for bilingual programs becoming active in the United States. The Brown v. Board of Education court case was one of the first cases to state that ELLs cannot be fully separated from other students throughout their education under the guise of helping them learn English. Civil Rights Act of 1964. The Civil Rights Act was a law enforced in 1964 after the Civil Rights Movement. This law states that race, sex, and national origin discrimination in public facilities, such as in schools, is outlawed. Although this law has been key in increasing the quality of ELL's education, it also blurred the lines between federal, state, and local educational authorities. Elementary and Secondary Education Act of 1965, also known as ESEA. Following the Civil Rights Movement and President Lyndon B. Johnson's War on Poverty, this Elementary and Secondary Education Act of 1965 was passed by Congress in 1965. The ESEA focused on school funding, policies, and procedures for low-income students, and it provided funding to state and local education agencies to education programs that were using federal funds. With the Civil Rights Act of 1964 and the ESEA in mind and working together, the two eventually allowed English language learners to have funded programs and an opportunity to succeed. Eventually is a key word because discrimination towards students that were learning English as a second language was an issue and was not handled before funding was given. In other words, Crawford Chapter 5 states, funding for bilingual education programs came first, before federal agencies had begun to grapple with the problem of discrimination against English learners in the schools. The Bilingual Education Act in Title VII in 1968. The Bilingual Education Act became known as Title VII in the ESEA after it was signed by President Lyndon B. Johnson on January 2, 1968. It gave school districts and families of ELLs grants through a competitive grant process, which restricted Title VII to only being provided to schools that had funding, and it allowed school districts resources to support educational programs, train teachers and aides, develop and disseminate instructional materials, and encourage parental involvement. The Bilingual Education Act was effective, with 6 revisions made on ESEA Title VII until the No Child Left Behind Act was passed in 2001. Wright claims that each revision made definitions clearer and acknowledged the importance of being bilingual and receiving a bilingual education. Cerna v. Portales Municipal Schools, 1972. Cerna v. Portales Municipal Schools was a U.S. Supreme Court case that was settled in 1972. This court case was officially the first court-mandated action that promoted bilingual education. Parents of Mexican-American children in New Mexico filed a lawsuit because of a language deficiency their children were having with English in school. Once the court case was settled, the final ruling required schools to desegregate by using native languages and cultural backgrounds while teaching. 2 years after the U.S. Supreme Court ruling, Hispanic students had a right to bilingual education within Title VI. Lau v. Nichols, 1974. Lau v. Nichols was a U.S. Supreme Court case that started in 1970 and was ruled in 1974. The case started when Edward Steinman, a poverty lawyer in San Francisco, brought this case upon the U.S. Supreme Court when he discovered that a Chinese client's child, Kenny Lau, was having difficulty understanding what was being taught in school because of the language barrier. Therefore, Lau began to fall behind and started failing his classes. Steinman argued that they were not receiving equal treatment on behalf of Brown v. Board of Education. According to Crawford, school officials within San Francisco refuted Simon's argument because they were not discriminating against the children that could not speak English, and in 1974, Supreme Court Justice William Douglas declared that because the children could not understand the English being spoken in the schools, they were not gaining a worthwhile education. With that said, the U.S. Supreme Court ruled on the rights of language minority students in 1974, and it forced San Francisco educators and other education programs across the country to have bilingual programs with the passage of the Equal Education Opportunities Act. Crawford states that allow remedies were created in 1975, and they instructed school districts on how to evaluate, instruct, and integrate English language learners into the classroom. Following the LAU remedies, LAU plans were created to catch educators that were not abiding by the LAU remedies. Educators had to sign consent agreements within the LAU plan to ensure that if they did not follow the remedies, they would be withdrawn from federal funding. Lastly, Crawford discusses how the LAU regulations were created in 1980, and they required schools where at least 25 LEP children of the same minority language group were enrolled in 2 consecutive grades in elementary or middle schools. Equal Education Opportunities Act of 1974, also known as EEOA. The Equal Education Opportunities Act was passed by Congress in 1974, and it enforced the ruling of the Lau v. Nichols U.S. Supreme Court case onto the entire country and was placed into the U.S. Code. The law forced education programs across the country to help ELL students with their language deficiencies in order to receive equal opportunities within their learning environments. Specifically, the law states, no state should deny educational opportunities to an individual on account of his or her race, color, sex, or national origin. By failure of an educational agency to take appropriate action to overcome language barriers that impede equal participation by students in its instructional programs. Castaneda v. Pickard, 1981. Castaneda v. Pickard was a U.S. Supreme Court case that was ruled in 1981. The ruling led to determining the creation of a 3-pronged test that examines if schools are appropriately meeting the needs of ELLs and following the EEOA. This test would come to be known as the Castaneda Standard and mandates the following prongs. The first prong states, the program must meet basic educational standards. The second prong states, appropriate amounts of faculty and resources must be delegated into the program. The third prong states, programs should assist the students in conquering English language barriers. Wright claims that although the Castaneda Standard has inadequacies, it has essentially become the law of the land in determining the adequacy of programs for ELLs. No Child Left Behind of 2001, also known as NCLB. No Child Left Behind was a law implemented by President George W. Bush in 2001. This reauthorized the Elementary and Secondary Education Act and included changes in Title I and Title III to target ELLs. Title I has a purpose of making sure every student has a fair, equal, and significant opportunity to obtain a high-quality education. Title III has a purpose of children understanding English, and its funding and curriculums ensure that LEP students attain English proficiency, develop high levels of the academic attainment in English, and meet the same challenging state and academic content and student academic achievement standards as all children are expected to meet. Wright claims that after a decade of enforcing and protecting No Child Left Behind, there is bipartisan recognition to No Child Left Behind is flawed because schools across the country were practically nowhere near of reaching the expectations the law required. Lastly, the American Recovery and Reinvestment Act of 2009, also known as ARRA. The American Recovery and Reinvestment Act was a law implemented by the Obama administration in 2009. The ARRA set aside over $44 billion in educational funding. The main program of ARRA is Race to the Top, RTTT, which offered more than $4 billion in grants for states to reform their educational programs. RTTT includes 4 prongs that focus on improving educational standards, faculty, data, and intervention tactics for ELLs, students with disabilities, and average students. Wright argues that RTTT has provided funds for educational reforms. Many are still concerned that requirement for high-stakes testing still exists. References.